The Wild Sheep Society BC has been doing horn aging courses across the province for the last year now, and we met in November in Richmond in late fall, November 2024, and the board of directors made a directive that we do horn aging in every region across the province this year, and we've executed on that. We had our last one in Cranbrook last weekend, and a variety of turnout. Some of them were a little bit thinner than others. I would say the average is 45 to 50. Our Sleuth Conservation and Mountain Hunting Expo, we had close to 200 in that one. So we literally reached hundreds of sheep hunters. And Mike, you and I did this podcast a couple of weeks ago, and then, of course, you led the Fort St. John horn aging as well in 7B there, and it was really, really well received. You've done a really good job on your PowerPoint, so it's kind of an opportunity to a lot of these horn aging courses we talk about, well, the professionals, not me or the society, but the professionals are talking about the biology and horn growth, and of course, how to field judge rams. And Mike, you've been hunting sheep for literally decades now and bring a ton of field experience to the game, and then of course you got your professional experience as well. So with that, we're going to turn it over to you, and if you don't mind just doing a bit of a intro, and then we'll get going.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you very much. And yeah, thanks everyone for being here tonight. Yeah, great turnout. Awesome to see. And yeah, I was saying earlier, it's not a surprise to me that there's the registration because I know how passionate of a group this is, Wild Sheep Society members, and any chance to talk about sheep, I know folks are interested in that. So yeah, thanks for having me here tonight. And yeah, a quick intro. Yeah, my name's Mike Bridger. By trade, I'm a wildlife specialist for the BC Ministry of Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship. I actually work for the Caribou Recovery Program as of now for the past 5 or 6 years. Um, Started my government career though as a regional wildlife biologist about 10 years ago, and through that description, I worked on a variety of different big game species, but I did have a focus on sheep. I'm up here in the Northeast region, the Peace region, so in Fort St. John. So I part of my job description was working on stone sheep management file and gained some experience, doing compulsory inspections, assessing rams for legality, and so spent quite a bit of time working on sheep professionally. And then, yeah, as you mentioned, I've been a pretty avid sheep hunter since right out of high school, really. Um, I started hunting at a young age, but didn't really get into sheep hunting until just out of high school and had a chance to go up to the Northwest Territories and start assisting on some hunts up there. That was back in 2006. So yeah, nearly 20 years ago. Um, Got a chance to work for some outfitters up there and ended up getting right into the guiding world and got a real, a lot of exposure to thin horn sheep quickly, sort of a crash course in the sheep. And so, yeah, what I'll be presenting tonight is sort of, thoughts of mine that I've had over the years, an amalgamation of sort of field-based experience and experiences that I've had professionally, and then a lot of experiences that I've pulled from having conversations with my colleagues in the biology world, but also hundreds and hundreds of conversations with sheep hunters as well of all different levels of experience. So that's what I'm hoping to get into tonight.
Outstanding, Mike. Yeah, really excited about it. And it was clear when we were talking on the podcast that you had your PowerPoint that you prepared for the horn aging course, and you kept referring to that, and we couldn't really do it on the podcast because we didn't have the visuals, and we were like, okay, this webinar is going to be critical. So, kind of an opportunity tonight to present that. So, for our listeners, the plan is that Mike's going to go through. He's going to give his PowerPoint presentation on horn aging. If you look on your Zoom platform on the bottom right-hand side, third from the right side, there's a Q&A bar in there, so you can just click on that. Feel free to throw in any questions in there. Unfortunately, we don't have the ability to sort of have you live here. Technically, we could, but it's with 150 people, it could be a bit challenging. So we've chosen that route. And what we'll do is kind of at either the end of each section, we might throw a few questions at Mike, but really at the end of his PowerPoint, that's where we'll really dive into that. So just put your questions in the Q&A bar there, or you can save them for the end. One thing I will note is that Mike's done a great job on his PowerPoint, and he's got each page numbered. So there might be some where you might want to ask another question about one of the rams on there, about maybe false annuli or age or something like that. So just note the page number. It's in the bottom right-hand corner. So just write that down, or even just throw it in the Q&A there, ask your question, and then reference the slide number, and then we can go back to it at the end of it. So um, we are recording this. We can't see you, so what you see on the screen is what we're recording. So no issues there, but we will have this for distribution down the road. So with that, we'll turn it over to you, Mike, and we'll get off and going.
Excellent. Thank you. Let me set up my screen here. So just give me a nod if you can see that there, Kyle and Greg. Yeah. Okay, excellent. Just gonna set my screen up a bit here. Okay, perfect. Well, I had a few opening thoughts. So yeah, the goal of this presentation, I wanted to take a bit of a deeper dive into considerations for assessing both legality and maturity. And to take some of the basics that you may have learned from other educational material or just some of your previous experiences and kind of build off that and try to apply it more in sort of real world field-based scenarios. So the structure for this webinar is to discuss a few different harvest scenarios and then go through some examples of how we assess for legality by curl or age, and then some ideas on assessing overall maturity. I'm going to throw a few curveballs in here. I'll show you some trickier examples, and then we'll take what we've learned from sort of the first portion of the webinar and try to apply it in some more like field photos or field-based scenarios. You'll see in a lot of my examples, I use kind of like an evidence-based approach to assessing age, and some examples will show you that there is uncertainty at times, which will really emphasize why I promote a cautious approach throughout this presentation. Definitely want to point out that there are many folks with more sheep hunting experience than I have. There's over 100 people logged in here. I guarantee there's participants that are more experienced in the field than I am, and I don't always have all the answers. I also want to point out that there will be times maybe where my messaging sounds a bit preachy or that I'm speaking from a soapbox, but just know that that's not my intention at all. My goal here is just to share some concepts and some tactics that may help you make your own informed decisions in the field. So as I mentioned, I'll be presenting sort of based off my own experiences gained in the field, experiences I gained doing compulsory inspections and legal determinations on sheep, and then additionally from a lot of conversations about sheep with biologists and sheep hunters. Now, I am certain there will be folks that watch this webinar and may disagree with like some of my approaches or my methods, and that's absolutely fine because I think that really further emphasizes my main takeaway in that a cautious approach needs to be taken when assessing rams, and it's not always as black and white as we think it is. So with all those caveats in place, let's dive in here. So this first concept I created is what I call the ram harvest diagram. So it's kind of broken down 3 categories of how we can harvest rams, but legal by full curl, legal by age, and then there's this overlapping area in the middle where I call it legal by full curl and age. So legal by full curl, that's where a lot of new sheep hunters find themselves hunting under that scenario. Legal by age is where generally only the most experienced sheep hunters should be practicing or operating in that realm. And then there's this middle ground here where I suggest that the majority, or certainly a lot of the newer and novice hunters, can be practicing in this realm of being legal by full curl and age. We'll dive into this a bit further here. Okay, so legal by full curl. This seems to be the less risky option. Like we have less rams coming in illegally or less rams confiscated off of the full curl legality than we do off of aging mistakes. So it seems as though hunters are having a better time or more certain in making that assessment of full curl in the field than they are counting annuli. And for good reason, and we'll get into that a bit. However, this may be the poorer option for conservation and for your hunting opportunities and so on. This is kind of the area where we have more young rams getting killed. So rams that are full curl, but maybe younger, anywhere from 5, 6, 7 years old. So if we jump over to legal by age, this certainly seems to be the riskier method of legality. For example, I go back to the year 2021 when I was still helping out on some sheep assessments. That was a really tough year for illegal sheep across the northern part of the province. In the Peace region alone, where I was working, I think we had, I think I saw over 18 sheep come in that ended up being illegal and confiscated. And I would say about 80% of those were mistakes on aging. And the other 20% would have been mistakes on assessing full curl. And I think if we looked at it, that trend would continue over time, and that the majority of mistakes are made by misaging rams based on their annuli. So this zone definitely requires skill and experience. Um, but this is often, a better option, or gives us a better option for harvesting mature rams. So here's the zone where we're able to kill rams that aren't full curl, but have the age, those 9, 10, 11-year-old rams that aren't full curl, that are great rams to harvest. And then, so in the middle, we have legal by full curl and age. So really here, there's no downside. You're hunting mature full curl rams. There's no legal risk. You're covered on both bases. However, this does require probably the most patience and restraint, because now you are narrowing down and limiting the number of rams that may be available to you for harvest, because you've sort of cut out those rams that aren't full curl, that may be by age, maybe legal by age, but now you're focused on rams that are both full curl and are mature. So it requires patience, but in my mind, and from what I've seen, doing legal assessments over the years, this is where most hunters should be striving to be. So let's dive into this off the top here. Like, why is it important to hunt for mature rams, or what's the value in hunting for mature rams? So a few things. The first one is the longevity of your hunting opportunities. Tonight, we're talking about thin-horn sheep pretty much exclusively. So in BC, we have a tremendous privilege as residents of BC to hunt thin-horn sheep every year if we choose, over the counter tag general open season. Remarkable opportunity. And we need to take steps to ensure that we can maintain that opportunity. So one way to look at it, the harvest that comes in, the animals that are killed are often a representation of the population that they're being harvested from. So they often represent the age structure within a population. So for example, if we're seeing lots of old rams getting killed and coming in through compulsory inspection, that suggests that old rams are plentiful on the landscape. And there's really no conservation concern to harvesting lots of old rams, assuming our harvest rates are not too high. And in the north here, I can confidently say our harvest rates are not too high. But on the flip side of that, wildlife managers will get a little uncomfortable if they start looking at that data coming in, the compulsory inspections, and it's showing a high proportion of young rams, say under 8 years old in the harvest. That will make wildlife managers a bit nervous. And that's when some of the conversations about regulation changes start popping up. For example, going from general open season to an LEH, or if it's already an LEH, reducing authorizations. One of the pieces of information that wildlife managers rely on is looking at that harvest data, because they don't always have up-to-date population estimates. So a lot of the time we're looking at that harvest data to see what the age in the harvest is. And if a high proportion of young rams are coming in, that can facilitate changes to your hunting opportunities. Okay, here I've got, now we're jumping into a bit more of the biology behind the reasoning for hunting mature rams. One piece is around compensatory harvest or compensatory mortality. So that's just kind of a fancy way of saying, by killing old rams, you're just compensating for rams that have a higher likelihood of dying over the course of the winter anyhow. So once these rams get into that older age class, 9, 10, 11, 12, the risk of dying naturally over the winter increases. So by harvesting those rams, there's a good chance you may be taking a ram that had a higher likelihood of dying anyway. We call that compensatory. Whereas when you're harvesting young rams, that might be what we'd call an additive source of mortality to a sheep population. The next piece is around breeding opportunity. So in all likelihood for thin horn sheep, the prime breeding rams are sort of the bigger rams in that 6, 7, 8-year-old age class. They're likely doing the majority of their breeding in most sheep populations. So by harvesting rams that are getting in that 10, 11, 12-year-old range, those rams in all likelihood have started to decline in terms of their like reproductive success. So if we can leave those 7, 8-year-old rams to do the majority of the breeding, that's good. We also tend to want to avoid harvesting young rams with fast growing horns. So that's often what happens in the case if we're shooting a 5, 6, 7-year-old ram that has attained full curl. That generally means that that ram has exceptional growth and likely good genetics in order to meet full curl at such a young age. So a case could be made that those are the type of rams that we may want to leave through their prime breeding years to pass on those genetics. And then lastly is the legal compliance. If you're killing old rams, you're going to be in compliance with the regulations. So those are some of my top reasons to hunt mature rams. Now, um, I don't want to over exaggerate the impacts of harvesting young rams. Okay, so at the end of the day, our regulations are a male only harvest, and that's a fairly safe way to harvest from a population. If there's one-off years where there are higher numbers of young rams getting killed, it's not going to be the end of the stone sheep population as we know it. So I don't want to overemphasize or over exaggerate that effect. But if we start seeing long-term or persistent or localized areas where the proportion of young rams in the harvest is high, then we may start to see this trickle-down effect towards some of the implications that I just described. So there's kind of two main harvest strategies. There's harvesting a ram for legality, and then there's harvesting a ram for maturity, conservation, and hunting opportunity. So I think it is an important question to ask yourself before you go out on your hunt. What scenario are you hunting under? Um, are you planning to shoot the first full curl ram you see, or are you going to look for something that's full curl but mature? Or are you going to just hunt off of aging annuli, for example? Um, and I would suggest that like just because you are a newer sheep hunter or you haven't got your first ram yet, that doesn't mean you can't take the time to at least assess for maturity prior to making your decision. And then you make an informed decision from there. So this is somewhat philosophical and ethical considerations, and ultimately this is a personal decision at the end of the day. My hope through this presentation is just to provide you with some information that will help you make your own informed decision while you're in the field. Okay, let's start getting into some assessments. So we're going to go through each category here and look at assessing these categories. So we're going to start in the full curl category. So full curl, I think most folks, again, I assume if you're watching this, you've probably got a bit of background in sort of the basics of sheep assessments and legality. Everyone's probably familiar with this diagram from the hunting regulations. To be full curl, we know the tip of the horn has to break that nasal plane that lies just beneath the nose bridge on the thin horn ram. And just to reiterate, I am talking about thin horns pretty much exclusively tonight. So that's the law. But there's not a lot of like educational material around how to actually assess this in the field. Most of our materials around aging. So I just had a few points that I wanted to reiterate here. So a lot of the time we just say in order to do this, you just got to get perfectly level with the ram and then see if you can see the horn tip above the bridge of the nose, and that's it. But you know, realistically, it is very difficult to get perfectly level with a ram in the mountains and assess whether you are perfectly level or not. Can you tell for sure that you're level, or are you slightly above or slightly below? So when we're looking at a ram from below, it overemphasizes the near side horn and underemphasizes the far side. As you can kind of see in this picture, this is kind of a pretty extreme example looking up from a pretty extreme angle. And then if we're looking from above, down on a ram, it tends to underemphasize the near side horn and overemphasizes the far horn. So we have to watch for that. Sorry, I'll back up a sec. So the simplest, safest way to assess full curl is to observe both tips above the nose bridge at the same time at any broadside angle. So if you can see both, if you're looking broadside at a ram and you might be slightly up and you might be slightly down, but if any point you can see both horn tips, then you know at least one of those horns must be full curl. So no matter what the angle, so that this takes the elevation out of this question a little bit, and I'll show you an example. So here's a ram here. We don't know for sure if we're slightly below or slightly above. It looks like we're probably slightly below this ram. We can clearly see one horn tip above on the near side. If we zoom in a bit, we can see that offside horn tip at the same time. So this lets us know conclusively that at least one of these, one side of this ram's horns is full curl, potentially both. But even if we are slightly below, we know that one side is legal. Just look at some other examples. So here's a ram from this angle. We're not perfectly broadside, so we can't see yet. We don't know if we're above, below. Looks like we're pretty level. Let's look at another picture. Okay, so now here we see it. So we're slightly below this ram, it looks like, but we can see both horn tips clearly across that nasal plane. The nasal plane is represented in the red line there, and it lies from the lowest point of the nose to the lowest point of the forehead. So the true line just generally lays right below, slightly lower than the actual nose bridge. Okay, I want to talk just quickly about tight curl rams that don't curl forward. So there are rams that tend to curl up tightly, say behind the eye. They don't extend forward to actually physically break the nose plane. Let's have a look at this ram. So you can see this ram, he's got a pretty good curl, but he doesn't come forward past the eye very much. So he doesn't actually extend forward to that nasal plane at the nose bridge. So first of all, are rams that don't physically break the nose bridge, can they be legal? The answer is yes, but you have to assess how they curl up and whether they intersect that nasal plane. If you extend it from beyond the forehead, beyond the eye, back into the horn, now you have to imagine that plane carrying onwards, and now you have to assess whether that horn tip intersects that plane. So this gets trickier, certainly. We can see this ram is probably doesn't quite make it, although he looks quite curly. He probably doesn't come up high enough. This requires extra patience. If you find rams like these, you're going to need to get a really good view, and I would highly suggest erring on the side of caution and only shooting those rams off full curl if they are clearly, the horn tip clearly comes up quite high and you've taken time to assess that. These are definitely trickier scenarios. So just to summarize, yeah, get level, as well as you can, relatively level. Here's an example. This ram's full curl, probably not by much, but you can clearly see the near side and the far side here break that nasal plane. This is what we're looking for. So like I say, try to get fairly level and then look to see both horn tips above the nose bridge from a broadside view at any angle, whether you're slightly above or slightly below. Definitely be patient, use good optics, and then a lot of folks have phone adapters for their spotting scopes these days. I definitely recommend that to get some video, get some still images, or take freeze frame off your video so you can freeze that point in time where you may actually get that quick glimpse of both horn tips over the nose, because it may, if a ram's moving around, it may just be a fleeting view of that. So that's definitely worth investing in that product. And then, yeah, like I say, beware of those rams that don't curl forwards above and break the physical nose bridge. Be extra careful with those. And last little pitch here is to assess for maturity while you're at it. There's no reason why you can't at least take a look to see if that ram is mature as well. And we're going to get into that in depth here shortly. So that's it for the full curl tips and suggestions. Kyle, how are we doing? Anything we want to address there? Should we move forward?
I think we're great, buddy. Looks really good.
Excellent. Okay, now we're gonna dive deep into the aging here. So shooting based on horn annuli. Okay, so we're gonna look at a bunch of sheep. So this is what we're looking for, right? Like we're looking for annuli stacked in tight to give us a sign that this is an old ram to kill. Feel comfortable killing ram like this off of annuli, right? We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, maybe 10-year-old ram, right? Not so fast. Here we have a 7-year-old ram, short of full curl, so an illegal ram. Very difficult ram to assess, even in a picture from 3 feet away. Just imagine trying to observe this ram from hundreds of yards away and trying to make that assessment based on true annuli. So here's a very scary example for a lot of folks around false annuli. This ram has fairly well-defined false annuli, and they also fit into the sequential pattern of growth that we would expect quite well. So this ram is kind of a stark reminder to sheep hunters of all levels of experience that mistakes can be made. And, even the most experienced sheep hunters, I suspect, would have a hard time with this ram in the field. You can barely tell this ram 7 years old until you have it in hand, and that is sort of a terrifying thought. Examples like this with false annuli that are well defined and follow the pattern that we would expect are fairly rare, and we'll get into that a bit more. But the fact that these rams exist like this is just a stark reminder to everyone that wants to just shoot off of annuli and aging that mistakes can be made in these scenarios. One common misconception that we hear fairly often is annuli in the hair. So I just want to nip this one in the bud off the top here. So um, it's the kind of the concept that maybe you counted to 7 rings and now and Hunter's saying, I think there's one in the hair that should make it 8. Let's shoot that ram. And I just want to say that there will not be an eighth annulus in the hair, early or late season. Do not bank on that. Annuli don't generally occur in the hair until you get to that really old stage, like 10-year-old rams or more in early season. Maybe a 9-year-old ram might have one in the hairline if it's late season, for example, when that hair is, an inch and a half or 2 inches long. At best, you might see an eighth ring at the hairline, say on an 8-year-old in the late season. But if you're getting the 7 on your count, do not ever anticipate there being another ring in the hair, no matter what time of the hunting season. So here's an example of an 8-year-old ram. Here's the eighth annulus, and this is an October ram, and that eighth annulus is still well above the hairline. Just to show you that these rings do not hide in the hairline, no matter what time through the hunting season. So just want to point that one out. Okay, I'm going to refer to a concept of the bottom 3 here. So when I talk about the bottom 3, I'm talking about the first 3 annuli starting from the tip of the horn onwards. This is often where the most impactful mistakes and disputes occur. Most of the disagreements occur here in identifying the first, second, and third annuli. Identifying these rings in the bottom 3 can be further complicated by brooming. We're going to talk about that a bit more. So you'll see throughout this presentation, I'm really going to emphasize the importance of finding your landmarks, particularly for the second and third annuli. So the lamb tip, which I've kind of highlighted here, The lamb tip often doesn't really present as a ring. Usually it's pretty subtle. We just kind of know it's there, right? On a ram that has its tips, we kind of know it's in that first inch to 2 inches is the lamb tip ring. Generally, the second annulus is the first that presents itself, but it can be subtle in some rams, especially in older rams. It seems to get smoothed out, so it can be difficult to see sometimes. Uh, I find the third annulus to often be the most prominent one, and the third annulus is the annulus that I like to landmark the most, and I spend the most time trying to correctly identify the third annulus in order to set me up for success for aging the rest of the ram, and we're going to get into that a bit more. But my point here is that we generally don't have as many issues identifying annuli that are closer to the base, at least not on younger rams where we are, where that is important. Often those annuli close to the base don't get really difficult to assess until you get to that older age of, 10, 11, 12. That's when they become subtle. There you might have a hard time determining whether that's a 10th or 11th annulus, for example. But on those like 6, 7, 8-year-old rams, usually those annuli close to the base are fairly easy for us to identify. It's usually confusion around these first three that gets folks into trouble. So landmarking the third annulus. So in my opinion, this is the most important annulus for aging. I often start aging from the bottom upwards. So from the horn tip towards the base is kind of the pattern I generally go in. If I'm assessing maturity, I generally look at the top of the horns first to see what these increments look like. We're going to get into that more. But if I'm actually counting age, I generally start from 1, 2, and 3. But really, I'm looking to identify this third annulus. The location of this third annulus can vary a bit depending on horn configuration, depending on age a bit, depending on size and length. This ram, is young and short of full curl, but the third annulus is up quite high. So if you're looking at, I often talk about rams being location of annulus relative to like the face of a clock. So in this case, we have the third annulus is up as high as about 9 o'clock. If this ram was facing the other way, we'd have it at 3 o'clock. That third annulus can be that high on rams that are close to full curl. But then when we look at curlier rams or longer rams, that third annulus can drop about as low as what I call 6 o'clock, like the bottom of the curl. And generally, and I always look for this, it is extremely rare to see that third annulus any farther forward in the curl, beyond the bottom of the curl, so past 6 o'clock. Even on the longest, curliest rams, that third annulus almost never goes past 6 o'clock. So keep that in mind as we move forward here. I think that's a really important landmark to consider. So that third annulus, 99% of the time is going to fall somewhere between 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock. But generally, on most rams of sort of average maturity and average curl, we find that third annulus back here a little bit. What I would call, say, like 4 o'clock on this ram. And if it was facing the other way, I'd call it about 8 o'clock. That's a very typical location for a third annulus, and we'll look at some more examples here. Sorry, meant to give you guys the opportunity to age that ram. Hopefully you're trying already. So this ram, we know the lamb tip's about here. It doesn't show itself very well. We can see a second annulus here. It's not super well defined, and we're landmarking this as the third. So that sets us up for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And don't believe there's anything else in there. It looks to be a 9-year-old ram, full curl, great ram. Okay, just landmarking this third annulus on some different horn types. So here, this is a pretty average ram, like a 36-inch full curl ram. Very typical location for that third annulus. Back from the bottom of the curl, back at about 7, 8 o'clock. Here we're looking at a ram more head on, and we can still often landmark that third annulus head on. This ram is different horn style, like it's more of a deep dropper. It's not really curly or long. So we expect to see that third annulus a bit higher up in the curl. So here we can see it clearly here. We know our lamb tip's right about here. Looks like this ram's broomed a little bit. We can see a second annulus here. That's about where we would expect it. and we can clearly landmark our third, and then we can go from there. So let's just take a sec to age this ram, give on the left, give everyone a few moments. This one is slightly tricky in a sense because I told you at late season, at best, you might find an eighth annulus at the hair. This is a late season ram. It doesn't show up super well, but there is an eighth annulus here right just above the hairline. If you looked at this ram from the front, you'd be able to see it, but here we go. Here's a nice lamb tip, shows up quite well. Here's our second annulus, nicely defined, and here's our third that is very well defined. 4, 5, 6, 7, and we do have an eighth one there. This ram, a bit older. Again, if we start landmarking our third, we can go up from there. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now it gets hard, right? Like hard to see these last annuli, but we know we get to 8 here, and we know there's still a bunch of horn left. In fact, there's more horn left than the previous growth increment. So we know there is at least one more annulus in there. And in fact, there's several. This is an 11-year-old ram. Okay, just some more typical third annulus locations. So again, these are fairly typical rams, typical kind of full curl rams. Here's that third annulus back here. It's not in the bottom, it's not forward of the bottom. So if you ever are looking at rings forward of the bottom of the curl, don't try to convince yourself that those are the third annuli. Another good example, here's the second annulus here, smoothed out a little bit, but we feel pretty confident in calling this our third annulus. This ram, is a good ram, fairly curly. The third annulus isn't quite at the bottom just yet. I can't remember if I aged these ones. Anyway, have a look at, I think, the right side ram. If folks want to take a crack at aging that one, I'll give you a few seconds. Yeah, so here we have it. So yeah, we landmark our third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth. Starts to get a little hard, but we can get to 8 pretty easy, and we still see there's a fair amount of growth left, and this ram is 9. Whether you would see that 9th ring in the field is debatable. Okay, I think we're looking at some curlier rams here. So I showed this ram earlier. This is quite a long ram, like almost 42 inches long, big curl. That third annulus still doesn't quite make it to the bottom of the curl. It's still just back from the bottom, back from 6 o'clock a bit. Here's another really curly ram, long ram, 42-inch ram. Let's landmark that third annulus. So we know the lamb tip's here somewhere. We don't see anything else along here until we get to what we feel pretty confident about being the second annulus, and now we can landmark our third. Here it is from this angle. Lamb tips up here somewhere. Nothing else until we get here. That's got to be 2, and this has got to be 3, just back from the bottom of the curl. And then if you're looking at that ram head on, you can see it fairly well. We look up here. Okay, that's got to be a lamb tip. We know 2's getting close to the bottom, and then we've got 3 back here. So again, just really emphasizing the landmarking of that annulus. Some more curly rams here. Here's a very, well above full curl flaring ram. Again, the third annulus just about makes it to the bottom of the curl on a very curly ram. Lamb tip 2, 3. Okay, so I think I've hammered home that point around that third annulus, and that'll be sort of a theme as we go through this webinar. Now we're going to talk about sort of a relatively new concept, not one that I ever remember really hearing about, in my early years of sheep hunting or aging rams, but it's this concept of the 1-year bulge. And most of you have probably heard about this. These images are from a document in Alaska that help hunters assess annuli and age on rams. This document refers to the 1-year bulge specifically. In this example, you can kind of see it here. Basically, it's sort of a growth that presents as a bulge. Often it'll be cracked there. Basically, it's what happens when that the horn first pops off the core, the bony core underneath. You'll get a bulge in the in the horn, and it can split. And sometimes it can be fairly prominent to the point where it may present as a ring or potentially look like an annuli. So we need to be cognizant of that. One thing I wanted to point out from this Alaska document is this wording right here, where they identify the second annulus quite a ways back. And they mention specifically that there's ridges on both sides of the annulus once you get to the second annulus, like the true second annulus has ridging on both sides. And we're going to talk about that a bit more in some of these examples. So it's suggesting there's a bulge here, very hard to see, probably not the best example of one. But this is also from that Alaska document. These lines are marked up by them in the document. I didn't add those lines, but here we see something that a lot of hunters may look at and just immediately call that 2. Like I think for many folks, including probably myself years ago, the first line or bump or bulge that we saw down from the lamb tip, we just called that 2 and didn't give it much thought. But that may not be the case. So this Alaska document is saying the lamb tips here, a pretty prominent first year bulge here, and that the second annulus is way back here. You can see what they're talking about, like the ridging has formed on either side of the annulus. So they're calling this 2. Let's look at some more examples. So many of you have probably seen this graph before. This is sort of a summary of growth increments between different annuli. For thin horn sheep we're looking at here, Dall sheep and stone sheep. What this is basically showing is that on average, say for year 1, right here, we go up from here and we hit our graph. At year 1, it's suggesting that the average lamb tip where it forms its annulus is about 1.5 inches, and probably, generally anywhere between 1 and 2 inches for the average lamb tip here at 1 year old. Now it's saying for the second annulus, if we go up from there, the average growth increment from where the lamb tip annulus left off to our next annulus at 2, we expect about on average 7 inches of growth between the lamb tip annulus and the second annulus. So just keep that in mind. That's sort of the average that we expect. If you look back at this example, if we were calling this 2, if you went from here, the lamb tip, to here, that's certainly well below 7 inches. Pictures are always a bit deceiving. They tend to make things look longer, but this is probably 3.5 inches. So if that was 2, that would be well below what we expect. But in this example, I think you can make a case that if you're calling this 2, that's probably above average horn growth. So that doesn't fit super well either. So we're going to get into these examples that cause confusion. This is where things get a little uncomfortable. So what are we looking at here? We've got a lamb tip here we're pretty confident in. We've got another annulus here that's pretty well defined. But what is this? This is pretty well defined. Is it a bulge? Is it a lamb tip annulus? Is it the second annulus? Well, it doesn't really fit super well. If we measured from here to here, that's probably less than 4 inches. In fact, I guarantee it's less than 4 inches, probably closer to 3 inches. So that doesn't fit with the graph that I just told you, because we're expecting like 7 inches of growth there. But if we measure from the lamb tip to here and call this the second annulus, well, that looks like a fair bit more than 6 or 7 inches, maybe 8 or 9. So that doesn't fit either. So what is this? My perspective on this is that, frankly, we don't always know the true answer. We don't know the life history of this ram. We don't know what happened. We don't always have a great answer for what this is. I would look at the evidence here and look at the second ring, and I would say to myself, would I expect the third ring on this ram to be that low down in the curl? I just showed you that third ring only presents down in the bottom on like the longest, curliest rams. I happen to know this ram is a 34-inch ram. It's not overly long. Would we expect the third annulus down this low? I would argue no. I would argue based on the evidence that this is the true second annulus. Like here's that ridging starting to form, whereas when we look at this feature, it's completely smooth around the edges. So I just want to make sure I hit all my points on that. So yeah, these scenarios pop up and they are definitely the subject of disagreement amongst sheep hunters, amongst biologists, amongst conservation officers. These are scenarios that we need to watch out for. And if you're dealing with rams like this, I urge you to exercise caution around this. Don't let this ring be the difference between a 7 and an 8-year-old ram. Because when you take that ram in for inspection, it may not go in your favor. Um, if you're dealing with this, if you see a ring present like this and it's not clear what that is, make sure you're looking for a ram that has at least 9 rings there. So at least worst case, if you're counting this and you can get to 9, at least worst case scenario, the inspector disagrees and they call it 8, but you still got a legal ram. I've got some more examples on this. Okay, sorry, so I kind of jumped ahead, but here we can age this ram. The rest of the annuli present pretty easily and pretty normally. Lamb tips up here somewhere. Don't know what that is. I would suggest people exercise caution and not call that 2. Call this 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. When I look at the increments up top, which we're going to start talking about soon, I would say those increments are fairly typical of what I'd expect to see on a young 6-year-old ram. Okay, we've got another one here. So this is the same ram. We're looking at both sides. Okay, there's something here. There's something here. Many sheep hunters may just come down from the lamb tip. We know the lamb tip's up here. They might get to this first sort of feature and just automatically call that 2. But does that make sense? You know, I told you that the third annulus doesn't present forward of the bottom of the curl. This is, again, sort of an average ram. It's a 36-inch ram, not overly long or curly. Would we expect the third annulus to be this far forward? I would argue no. Does this location make sense for a third annulus? Based on what I've shown you thus far, I would 100% be comfortable calling that the third there. So what this is, I don't always have a great answer for you. Is it a bulge? Is it a big lamb tip? I don't know, but I would argue that that's not the second annulus in that case. So I'll just give folks a second to try to age this ram before I give it away. You know, I've already sort of alluded to landmarking this as the third. You know, this presents as a pretty typical 4th-year ring. I don't talk about the 4th specifically for landmarking, but it's often sort of a horizontal ring, and that's basically perfectly horizontal on that horn. So let's have a look here. So this is what we've got. We've got the lamb tip. We've got this unknown. We're going to err on the side of caution and call this 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and appears to be an 8-year-old ram. So in this case, you know, the hunter's fine. I mean, this ram happens to be full curl too, but if it wasn't full curl, at least there is a margin for error in that maybe this hunter thought it was 9, calling this 2, but worst case scenario, it gets assessed as 8, and you can still go home with your ram at the end of the day. Okay, another example of this. So this, again, this is both sides of the same ram. Now, so we've got another sort of unknown ring here. Again, short distance, you know, we see a pretty well-defined lamb tip and we see a pretty well-defined ring here, but now like we've got some ridging occurring on both sides of that ring. And if that were the second annulus and this were the third, well, now I'm pretty comfortable with calling that the third annulus based on the location in the horn curl compared to the other examples. So although this appears to be well below average growth from lamb tip to second, you know, that's probably 4 inches at most, it appears that there is evidence to suggest that this is a true second annulus. So the differences in these examples that I'm showing you is pretty minute, but we're looking at the evidence that I've talked about, the ridging, the placement of what would then be the third annulus. and we may be able to make a confident assessment that that is in fact a true second annulus. Um, yeah, I guess so. My take-home message on these types of rams, if you see something like this that doesn't make a ton of sense, it's not lining up as to the kind of growth we'd expect, don't let this feature here be the difference between a 7 and an 8-year-old ram, okay? Find that on what you think is a 9-year-old ram and give yourself some wiggle room. Um, yeah, again, these scenarios here and these rams are definitely debated. I'm sure there's some folks watching this right now that are shaking their fists at the screen with some of these examples that may be adamant that that is a second ring in some of these other examples. Maybe you're correct, but I'm just suggesting that there is uncertainty around this and to exercise caution around this scenario. Okay, hopefully I've hammered that point home. So now we'll add a little more complication, and that is brooming. So when a ram sort of breaks off or rubs off a portion of the horn tip. So generally brooming just removes the first annulus. So removes the first lamb tip and maybe a bit beyond that. Really heavy brooming sometimes might go past the second annulus, but it's rare. So and then sorry, brooming past the third annulus, so it basically doesn't occur. I mean, if anything's broomed or broken past the third annulus, that's more just what I would call a broken horn. It's not just going to be rubbed past the third annulus. So here's a ram here, kind of a tricky one in the sense that we do have a feature here right below the brooming. Now this gets even harder because we don't have our landmarks of the first annulus or the lamb tip. So again, now we're wondering, well, what is this? There's something there, pretty smooth around the edges. Um, this ram, although it may appear big, again, it's hard to judge these rams in photos in the jig, but this is a 32-inch ram, not overly long. Would we expect that third annulus to be that low on a ram that's not super long and super curly? I would argue no. Let's have another look. So here's the other side, and this is how that ram was assessed by the inspector. They identified this as the second annulus. I would tend to agree. There may be people shouting at the screen right now saying, well, that's way too heavy to be a second annulus. But keep in mind here, like without knowing the dimensions of the ram, that is hard to judge. Like I happen to know this ram is 14 inches on the base, which is, decent mass, but it's not overly heavy. Like that's actually pretty average for rams in the Peace region. So this ram is not way above average in mass. So um, I wouldn't bank on this being a third annulus here because of the mass or the weight of the horn or anything like that. All the evidence suggests that this is likely the second annulus here. But the point being that brooming complicates this a bit because now we've lost one of our landmarks. So again, here's another one, broomed at kind of an inconvenient location. It's broomed right above some sort of prominent kind of bulge or ridge. Um, Again, a lot of hunters might just like see this as the first kind of feature down from the lamb tip and jump to call that 2 years old. But I would caution folks not to do that. Maybe that's correct in some scenarios, but that may lead to troubles. Um, Here again, we go back to trying to landmark the third annulus. Which one is it? I've shown you many examples that the third annulus generally is never this far forward. Like this annulus here is forward of the bottom of the curl. Again, this is not an overly long or curly ram, so I would not expect the third annulus to present that far forward. If we call this 3, I'm pretty comfortable with that. Like that's where we expect to see that third annulus. And, here's again, classic location for the fourth. So although this appears to be some sort of feature, don't bank on that being the second annulus. I think we can try aging. This one, I'll just give folks a second to take a crack at that one. Let's see. So yeah, the lamb tip, we're pretty confident it's broomed off here. So the lamb tip might be up here above my red line somewhere. Feel good calling this 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And the eighth annuli again starts to get hard to see as you get closer to the base, but this appears to be an 8-year-old ram. One thing I'll start talking about soon is kind of the horn increments at the top of the horn. These sort of, with time, as you look at enough of these rams, you can look at the top of the horn and look at those increments and start to get a sense for what kind of age category you're looking at. And I would look at these increments like this, and right away think I'm in the 7 to 8-year-old category just based on the spacing here. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we talk about assessing maturity. Okay, some more Broomed Ram challenges. Yeah, again, it can cause misinterpretations for hunters and inspectors because we're losing that one of the landmarks. This is often scenario like a ram that might cause disagreement because we don't know where that lamb tip extends to. Um, some folks may say, well, this ram's broom very heavy. There's lots of mass here, and some folks might jump to call that the third annulus. And I would suggest that that's probably incorrect. Again, would we ever expect that third annulus to be this far forward in the curl, like well past the bottom of the curl? I would argue no. This with tips, this probably is a pretty curly ram. I don't think he's overly long, but I'd feel way more comfortable calling this the third annulus back here. So I'll give folks a chance to age this one. Again, we're going to start looking at the tops of these horns, like these increments, like some pretty big increments here. Are these increments that align with what I would expect to see on an 8-year-old ram? Not really. They're pretty big, largely spaced. This is much more typical of what I would see in a 7-year-old ram. Oh, sorry, I thought I put the dashes on this one, but we're going to call this ram 7. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. One point about brooming that we're going to talk about a bit later too when we get into our field examples is just err on the side of caution. I told you that it's very rare for a ram to broom past 2. So to be cautious, the first prominent ring, the first prominent annuli that you see after brooming, just call it 2. Don't ever assume that this might be a third annulus here beyond the brooming. Okay, I mean, it may be if it's very heavily broomed and the other locations of the annuli align, but more often than not, you're looking at the second annulus being like the first prominent annulus you see after brooming. And that's a conservative way to approach it. If you call it 3 and you're wrong, you may be setting yourself up for trouble as you continue to age that ram towards the base of the horn. I think that's all I wanted to say on broomed rams for now. Oh, this is the other side of that same ram. Now you'll see my marks. We're calling the lamb tip up here 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, all right, we'll switch gears a bit here. We're going to talk about false annuli. So I told you that the bottom 3, as I call it, is where a lot of hunters are getting mixed up these days, which leads to illegal rams getting harvested. I'd say the other most common area of mistakes is around false annuli. I showed you an example off the top there that where false annuli were very convincing. I would say that ram's a bit of a rarity in that they're that convincing. Certainly, false annuli can show very prominently, but usually they follow an atypical pattern. Like right away, if you're familiar with sort of the expected sequences of growth, once you get past the third annulus, you're expecting the sequences of growth to start decreasing. If there's false annuli in there, they start sticking out as like something's not right with the pattern. Like this, for this ram, as an example, like right away, we can get to here and move on. Like something's starting to present in the middle here. Well, that doesn't make sense. Something's presenting here. That doesn't make sense as a growth increment from here to here. Same story from here to here. That doesn't make sense to be a growth increment, whereas from here to here is the pattern we would expect. Again, now we would expect a pattern like from here to here, but there's a pretty prominent ring in the middle, and that's likely presenting as a false annuli. That just doesn't line up with the sequential pattern of growth that we're expecting. Now, this looks fairly easy here. Like you can identify that there are false annuli, but actually identifying which ones are the false ones and which ones are the true ones in the field can be very difficult. Um, I'll give folks a second to try to age that RAM. Here's how that looks. Lamb tip, here's kind of, again, a prominent ring. Does this one line up to be a second annulus? Debatable. Again, I wouldn't bank on it. Anyway, we can go there, 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 and there are true annuli. The blue lines are starting to point out the false annuli. And so often false annuli appear in sort of a repeat pattern. Generally, there's something going on in that ram's yearly movements or its yearly uh, yeah, choices of home range or like where it's foraging that's causing like a stoppage in growth at some point in the year, probably sometime in the spring or summer. And it's causing these to occur. And in this ram, it's occurring pretty much every year. You can see there it started happening after year 2 or 3, or sorry, year 1 or 2, and it's happening every year since then. So look for that. If you're not sure what you're looking at, if you're looking at something like this ring that kind of appears to be false, go back to the previous increment and see if there's another ring there that doesn't make sense. And then, you may start seeing it. It doesn't always present in multiple years, but a lot of the times it will. Um, yeah, okay, let's carry on here. Here's another one where there's some rings that look a bit suspicious, but not necessarily showing up every year, certainly not prominently, but there's something here and here that don't, well, that present as rings, but they don't look quite right. We've got a pretty prominent lamp tip here, 1, 2, 3, 4. If this, something is here, but it doesn't meet the pattern again, like that is not an increment we'd expect. Difficult to do in the field, but when you look at a picture up this close, like you can see this ring, whatever it is here, like it doesn't cut through the horn edge. Like it's not prominent enough to be a true annulus. Same here, like there's a pretty prominent ring, but again, for one, it doesn't really fit the pattern. For two, it matches the pattern of the false ring in the previous year. And again, if you look really closely, you can see it doesn't cut through the horn edge. So again, easy to do from this up close perspective. We'll get some examples from farther away to see how folks do, but I'll give everyone a second to age this RAM. Okay, so yeah, again, we can landmark the third quite easily. It's up quite high on this RAM. 3, 4, 5. This is just a 6-year-old RAM. Not sure if this RAM's full curl or not. If you accidentally included these as annuli, thinking this is an 8-year-old ram, well, that's potentially the difference between a legal sheep and an illegal sheep, if those are mistaken for true annuli. Here, we do start to see a pattern of some kind of false rings appear earlier in the life, but they're not super prominent until we get to about here. So those are the false rings in blue. Another kind of tricky one. I think I'll just give folks a second to have a look at that RAM and see what they think. This was a wolf killer ram. Comes from sort of middle to late winter. So this is a case because of the timing where it probably is laying an annulus right close to the horn base, close to the hairline, but that's not a scenario you'd see during hunting season. So here we go. This is what we deem to be the true annuli. So the lamb tip, nothing really prominent here until we get to this point here. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and it has just formed an eighth annulus right close to the base. But of course, we see some other rings along the way that sticking out that might fool us into thinking that ram is older than it is. Tricky one. Again, assessing that in the field has its challenges. So a photo of one on the hoof here. Not a lot of false annuli in this ram, but potentially enough to maybe get you on the wrong path. Particularly, we're looking up here at the top of the horn. There's a pretty prominent ring here on both these angles. Kind of fits the pattern, could potentially get you down the road of thinking there's annuli starting to stack up here if you look at these increments. But upon closer inspection, you can see that that ring does not cut through the horn. You can see from this angle as well that it just dies at the edge, the ridge of the horn, whereas the true annuli here cut through pretty clearly. So that's a ring that could potentially get you in trouble depending how you're aging that ram. So here's what we're looking at. We've got a lamb tip here. We've got a line down here again. I think there could be a case to be made that that's the second annulus. Very short growth. If you wanted to be conservative and safe, you could call this 3. Sorry, you could call this 2. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Or, if you included this, you may ended up aging that at 8. And this, again, I don't have the perfect answers for these scenarios. This is a perfect example of where to be extra cautious on a RAM like this. If I look at this RAM and I see, when I look at the growth increments up top, they're quite large. I look at the face of this RAM, the big kind of slope forehead and the short nose. This ram presents to me as a young ram. And because of the uncertainty here, this is a ram I'm not going to mess around with if I'm trying to assess legality based off of age. Okay, Kyle, I think that's the end of sort of the deep dive into aging. Then we're going to kind of switch gears to sort of just concepts around maturity. But I just wanted to check in, see how folks are doing. I know we're already just over an hour in. Oh, you're on mute there, Kyle.
Thanks. I did have one question come up, and it was kind of pertaining to slide 16, and I think it's kind of been answered, but
Okay.
you were talking about the bottom three, and the question one is a lamb tip considered 1 year? So if
Mhm.
you want to go to that now, or you can do it at the end of the presentation.
Yeah, well, this won't take me too long. Backtrack here. So if we go, I think the examples, yeah, this one. So yeah, the answer is yes. Like we consider the lamb tip for the purposes of counting. We consider the ring of the lamb tip, which again doesn't often present. We're calling that 1. If you want to get into the details and the technicalities of the timing of when annuli are formed, this gets formed in late winter, these rings. So the bulge or the ring for the first annulus is formed probably around 9 months of life. So technically, that's 9 months, and somewhere in between here and here is that ram's first birthday. So this, by here at this point in growth, it's probably reached, May or June. This technically is 1 year around here. But to keep it simple, for the purposes of aging, we just call this 1, 2, 3. It's a good point to clarify. So yeah, thanks for asking that. I'm just gonna skip back ahead. Sorry. Okay. All good, Kyle?
You betcha. Awesome.
Okay. All right. Hopefully folks are hanging in there all right. Again, if I'm moving too fast, this is recorded, and I think will be posted on Wild Sheep Society's webpage and YouTube page. So you will have an opportunity to go back and go through this slower if that helps. And hopefully we have time to answer some questions at the end too, if you ever want to go back. So again, not trying to rip through this too quickly, but recognizing we got a fair bit of ground to cover. All right, so now we're going back to that concept of legal by full curl and age. So now we're talking about, so say we're looking at a ram that we've already assessed as full curl. Now we're just going to start talking about identifying maturity or lack thereof. I'm just reposting this page to sort of reiterate the value of hunting mature rams again for your, like your future hunting opportunity for and sort of the betterment of the breeding population, legal compliance, all those pieces. Okay, so shooting for maturity. So I kind of alluded to it earlier. The first thing I look at it, every ram I look at in the field, the first thing I look at is these increments, growth increments at the top of the horn. And if I see big increments like this, I immediately just lower my expectations. In fact, I generally just rule that ram out right off the top. I know that's not a ram that I'm interested in pursuing. Like increments like that are getting into the realm of, that 5, 6, maybe 7 age range, and it's just not where I want to be. So this is the first thing I look at is these gaps. And then if it's close, then I might start actually counting and I do that from the bottom up. But this is the first thing I look at, those increments. And once you've looked at that enough, you'll start to get a sense for what these represent. Like these are very wide increments, pretty typical of like a 5 or 6 year old ram. We've already looked at this one. We know this one's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 year old ram. Um, Again, going right to the top of the horn, huge increments here, huge growth, no annuli stacked in, no reason to believe from this point onward there would be any other annuli. And we can see it's a clean slate. This ram screams as a young ram. I think I aged this one, yeah. So lamb tip, there's not really anything here. I put a question mark by. There's a bit of a bulge, but based on the way this ram grows, I think we'd skip right to here to call that 2, 3, 4, 5 year old ram. Okay, here's another ram. Just an incredible specimen. Long, twisty, like, the ram, the horn configuration that everyone dreams of. We look though at the top of the horns and we see huge increments, no annuli, stacking closer together. From this point on, like we can clearly see there's no other annuli. Um, Definitely right away we know that's like an exceptional ram. It's got exceptional genetics. I know it's a 41-inch ram, highly spaced increments here. Look, here's what it looks like from the side, clearly full curl. But again, right away you look at this, and you know that that ram is in that sort of 6-year-old range. And oops, sorry, I didn't add lines to this one, but I feel pretty comfortable calling this the lamb tip 2 here. I think I feel okay about just given how curly this ram is. I think that's a safe location for the third here, 4, 5, 6. So a 41-inch 6-year-old ram, hard to argue with anyone about shooting a ram like that. Like it's an incredible specimen. Um, but it's also a ram that was just kind of entering the breeding stage, most likely. He's so big, maybe he was breeding successfully at 5, but really this ram probably was just getting to its prime breeding stage. Probably had 3 more years of prime breeding, maybe 4 years if you include that fall. Um, had yet to really contribute to the breeding population fully. So, this is a ram, as hard as that may be to walk away from, that's a ram folks would have to make a call on whether they want to shoot that ram or leave that ram to continue contributing to the population. Again, another really curly ram here. But right away, I'm looking at the top of the horn and I'm seeing big growth increments here. Not quite as big as the last one. So right away, I'm seeing like gaps like this kind of make me think we're in that 7-year-old range. Um, so let's look here. So lamb tip kind of presents itself there. Pretty comfortable with that as the second location. Second annulus location. Here's the third, getting close to the bottom of the curl, but not quite there. Again, this is a really twisty, curly ram. 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old ram. Again, prime young ram, great genetics. That's a call that folks need to make in the field, whether that's a ram they want to harvest or a ram they want to leave. So what does it look like in the field? Okay, so you got this ram up in the skyline, everything here, there's characteristics here that would get folks excited, I would think. We've got what appears to be pretty long, curly ram. Horn tip appears to come up fairly high. Um, but if we get another look at that ram, what are we seeing? Right away, we're looking at the top of the horn, and I'm seeing huge growth increments here, from here to here and here to here, and I'm not seeing anything in between, and nor would I really expect to in this case. So what are we looking at here? I believe we're looking at a 5-year-old ram. Lamb tip we know is here, so therefore, somewhere in the bottom, it doesn't show super well. We expect the second. We're landmarking this as the third, fourth, fifth, and doesn't really appear to be anything. Like there is sort of a line there, but we would expect more growth than that if that was a 6-year-old ram. So again, very beautiful ram, but yeah, 5-year-old ram, probably one you want to leave behind there. We'll start looking at some body and face characteristics. I'll start pointing this out. Like this ram's a late season ram, so it's a little harder to tell, but it does have, kind of this, what I call like a sloped forehead, coming off the forehead, coming off the horns to the nose, like it's sort of bulgy, and then it's got a really short nose here. And just keep that in mind as we start looking at the faces of some of these rams. So signs of maturity. So most of us have probably heard discussion about this. Well, you can also look at body shape. You're looking at that blocky build or the pot belly or maybe even a swayed back. Those can be good lines of evidence. I find that does get harder to assess the body shape as evidence for maturity as you get farther into the season. Like later season, those sheep, the hair grows, they all look kind of blocky to me. So that might be an easier clue early season. We've all heard, looking at the nose, if it's a long, this ram's got a much kind of straighter profile from the forehead to the end of the nose, like a long nose, maybe slightly Roman or bumped, can be signs of maturity. The social status in the band of rams that you're looking at can be a bit of a clue as to who is the most mature ram. Most mature ram generally gets some of the best bedding spots, or he'll kick other younger subordinate rams out of their beds, or you'll see it in the way that they posture amongst each other. If you watch a band of rams for a while, you can generally get an idea of who the lead ram is and who the dominant ram is. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that dominant ram is old. The band of rams you might be looking at may only, it may be composed of young rams, and the dominant ram may only be 7 years old. Like not every band of rams has 8, 9, 10-year-old rams in it. So you have to take that with a grain of salt as well. Horn characteristics get mentioned at times too. We talk about brooming can be associated with older rams, like heavy ridging along the tops of the horns can be associated with age, or like really dark colored horns. Um, Again, these are all potential lines of evidence, but none of these are rules. Oh, sorry, spoiled this one. Hopefully folks got a chance to like look at this. Here's kind of what we're looking for, right? Like I'm looking at the top of the horn, I can see short increments, first of all. This ram's not super easy to age, but if you look closely at the base, like you're seeing some really close age increments. So we've got a lamb tip up here. We've got a second annulus here. Because it's an older ram, it doesn't present super well. Like it's been smoothed out over years of laying in the dirt or rubbing against willows or whatnot. Feel good about landmarking our third here, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Let's say in the field, some of these last ones can be hard to see. If you can get to here at 8, and you've still got quite a bit of horn left, and this is an October ram, so we've got pretty long hair here. If you can see more horn still available than the previous growth increment, you're pretty confident that there's at least one, maybe two annuli still in there before the end of the horn. Okay, but we talked about horn characteristics. folks say, okay, if it's got dark horns, it's an old ram, or if it's yeah dark horned and heavy and broomed, okay, well this ram is quite dark. Give folks a second to try to age that one. I'm going to show you the other side of this ram. Looks a little bit lighter now, but still like a dark horned ram, um, broomed. Yet, if we count, we got a lamb tip up here somewhere, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old ram. So, point being is that just because it has darker than average horns does not mean it's an old ram. Again, okay, we talked earlier, some folks will say, well, if it's got heavy ridging on the outside of the horns, or if it's broomed, those are signs of an old ram. Well, give folks a second to try to age this one. So again, despite these horn characteristics, we're looking at quite a young ram here. Broomed, just past its lamb tip somewhere, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old ram. So again, these horn characteristics may be lines of evidence in some cases, but they're not the rule. So again, that's kind of what we're looking for, right? We look at the top of the horn, like we see increments that are quite close together. We see a big blocky head. From the side profile, you see that sort of Roman nose. Um, this ram has the characteristics of what we're looking for. I mean, this is an exceptional ram, but this has those characteristics of an older ram. And I think I put lines on this one for folks to try to age if they want. I'll give folks a second to look at that one. Okay. Again, big long curly ram, nearly 42 inches, lamb tip, second annulus. Yeah, it makes sense. Like there's ridging on both sides, prominence where we'd expect. Third annulus, not quite at the bottom, even on a really long ram. The third annulus, we landmark that. We're happy with where we find that. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now it gets hard, right? Like in the field, it's hard to see those last annuli, but if we get to 8 pretty comfortably, and we still got quite a bit of horn left, like probably twice as much horn left as the previous increment. So we feel pretty confident saying that there are going to be annuli stacked in there. All right. Can take another. I'll just touch base with Kyle here, see how we're doing. We're going to switch gears a bit to see how this looks in the field. So we're going to look at a bunch of field photos and see how we make up. I'll just check in with Kyle to see if there's any questions or how we're doing.
I think we're good. No questions so far, so I think we keep rolling with it if you're good to go.
Okay. All right. We're kind of on the home stretch, but we're going to take what we've learned in our sheep hunting experiences and our sheep education experience and try to apply to what it looks like in the field. So now things get challenging. So, you look at that ram and you'll say, well, Mike, that's kind of a crappy picture. Like, how are we supposed to count rings here? But this is kind of the reality of what you're now facing in the field. Blurry images through your spotting scope, heat waves, precipitation in the air on your scope, bad lighting. Some rams have really prominent annuli, some have really subtle annuli that are almost impossible to count. Dark horns versus light horns. You've got sheep on the move. You're doing this at great distances. This is where things now get really challenging, and you have to apply what you've learned and do this in a very cautious and patient manner. So, let's look at this ram. First of all, is it full curl? Well, we know we're looking down on it a bit because that far side horn tip is overemphasized and the near side one is underemphasized. Certainly looks like a long ram. Probably going to be full curl, but we're going to have to get more level in order to assess that for sure. But now let's look at age. So let's start looking for our landmarks. So we know the lamb tip's up here. We know this is a pretty long curly ram. We can definitely see something here. Feel pretty good about that being a second annulus in here. And that would make this one here, again, like you can only see a portion of it, barely see it. We could landmark this as our third. We feel pretty good about that because it's, this is a curly ram, but that third annulus is still back from the bottom of the curl. So that makes this 4, 5, 6, 7 we can see. 8 we can see, I think, on most people's screens. So we get to 8 and we've still got space here. So I'm pretty happy with what I'm seeing with this ram. I got to 8. I could probably feel pretty comfortable thinking there's a ninth there. This is a ram I'm going to be interested in and want to get a closer look at. But I'm probably looking at a full curl ram, and I'm probably looking at a 9-year-old ram now. I got to get closer and confirm. Okay, another great photo of a ram in the field here. Right away, I look at the top of those horns, and I'm kind of liking what I'm seeing here, right? Like we're getting these tight increments. They all look pretty legitimate to me. There's no really abnormal spacing. Um, so okay, right off the hop, I'm liking what I'm seeing. I'm gonna try to landmark that third annulus. So we know there's a lamb tip up here. This ram's got both his tips. We come down, we can't see it necessarily, although it looks like there might be something here. We know there's a second annulus somewhere in between here and here, right? So feel pretty good about saying there's a number 2 in there, and then this presents as our third annulus. So we feel good. We've landmarked that third annulus. Again, this is a beautiful curly ram. That third annulus is just back from the bottom of the horn. So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We get to 8. Still got quite a bit of horn back. I'm pretty sure we see a ninth in here, and there's still space on that horn. And you know, based on the foliage and everything, it looks like this might be a bit later season. This ram appears to be 9 for sure, and could be 10. There could be a 10th annulus at the hairline. So I'm definitely liking what I'm looking when I look at a ram like that. Okay, we're looking head on at a ram here. So again, let's try to landmark. So we know there's a lamb tip here. Now we're not sure. Like from this view, we see a ring here. Is that the second? From a conservative approach, we'd probably say so. So being super conservative, we landmark this as the third for now, unless we get a different angle that tells us otherwise. I would landmark this as 3, 4, 5, 6. There might be something here. I happen to know this picture is from July, so this ram's going to grow a little bit more. That could be a 7th. Either way, like I'm looking at these increments, and I'm looking at the fact that I may not know for sure if there's a third, so I got to call this 3 right away. I'm thinking this is probably not a ram I'm going to want to shoot, or certainly not going to want to play around with it as far as assessing age in terms of legality. It's another great pictures here. So we've got 2 rams laying here. This is about as clear as you really ever expect it through the spotting scope for the most part. So here's what we're working with right away. I'm looking at the top of the horns. I see increments here so 1 increment there, 1 increment there. Not loving it. Again, on this ram, 1 increment there, 1 increment here to here. Like right off the hop, these rams just give me the feeling of that 7 to 8-year-old range. So now, okay, let's try to assess these. So I'm pretty sure there's a lamb tip here. Our first prominent rings here. There's nothing in between, so that's 2. Looks like we've landmarked our third ring right here, 3, up pretty high, which suggests, this ram might be on the younger side. So 3, 4, 5, 6 we can get to pretty easily. We expect at that point, to still have large growth increments. I'd say at best, maybe there's a 7th annuli that we can't quite see. It's certainly above the hairline, but it's just not presenting super well at this angle. This is 6, but probably a 7-year-old ram. Either way, not a ram we're going to mess with, especially if it's not full curl. This ram looks a little better. Like he's got some characteristics like of a kind of a broom nose there. He's got a longer face, whereas this ram, he's got that sort of sloped forehead that goes into a relatively short nose. Like so, even just the face of this ram looks younger. This ram appears to be broomed a little bit. So probably broomed its lamb tip off. We see something here, probably 2. So we're going to landmark this as 3. Feel pretty comfortable and conservative with calling that 3 there. 4, 5, 6. You can get to 7, and there's still some room left. This ram very well could be 8. In fact, he's likely 8, but this ram doesn't appear to be full curl. You're not giving yourself much wiggle room. Again, this is a ram unless you are feeling very confident about that, you may want to walk away from as far as shooting off of the age, just in case something you've misread something. Okay, nice little band of rams. Let's look at a couple of the bigger ones in the group. So this bottom ram here, he's nice looking ram. Doesn't present as that he's going to be a really mature ram. Like just look at the increments right away. Right away I'm thinking, well, that kind of looks typical of say a 7-year-old. So again, we're looking for the lamb tip up here somewhere. We can't see it. We know it's there. And we know somewhere there's going to be a second annulus. Can't really see it from this angle. So we're going to landmark this as number 3 up here. Feel pretty comfortable with that placement, calling that 3, 4, 5, 6. And I think, we get to 7 and then not sure we see much beyond that. So again, this is a ram I'm not going to mess around with. This ram up here, again, fairly curly. Um, has some signs of maturity, potentially in the face. I look at the top, the increments aren't great, but this might put us in that ballpark of a 7 or 8-year-old ram. I'm looking at the lamb tip up here. The next ring down is in the bottom of the curl is 2. Okay, that makes sense. Landmarking my third annulus right here. 3, 4 is kind of where we'd expect. 5, 6, 7. And then we've got quite a bit of horn left. Appears there's something here. Can't say for sure if that's a legit annulus, but we get to 7 and there's still room left. There's a good chance this ram's 8 years old. Might be full curl. If it's full curl and you've assessed it and you think it's 8, then this might be a nice ram to harvest. Okay, keep going here. All right, we'll look at the top of the horn. And right away, like at first glance, you're seeing features that you like. Like it seems like there's some annuli that are quite close together, but something doesn't feel quite right here. There's an annulus, or sorry, a ring that is very close to another ring. See it here? We can also see it on this ram when we look at the back of the horn. Like something's not lining up. That to me is giving the vibe of a false annulus. So let's try to age this ram conservatively. So we know the lamb tips up here. 2 is likely in the bottom of the curl here. We feel really good about landmarking this as the third annulus right here. We come up, we've got 4. Now we can jump across to the other side of the horn if you want, like come straight across. And now we've got 4 here on this side. 5. Now here's that false one. We think we're going to skip right over that to 6, 7, and lots of horn left. And it looks like we've got an 8 here. Age that ram at 8 on the hoof personally. So now, you got to assess if it's full curl and make a decision. If you can only get 8 annuli and you're seeing some funny things and it's not full curl, then you may want to step away from this ram. Happen to know this ram was indeed 8 years old. Give folks a second to just look at that. Okay, we're an hour and a half in. We are getting there, folks. So thanks for hanging in with me. Just some examples of the back of the horn. So, different angles, different lighting can present annuli differently. Just showing as an example on these rams, you can see the annuli quite clearly from the back of the horn. Same with this ram up here. We won't try to necessarily age these rams, but right away I'm seeing pretty big growth increments, especially on this one. They're not close to full curl. You can even kind of see that baby face of like a sloped forehead and a short little nose here on both these rams. At first glance, I'm not loving what I'm seeing as far as maturity. But here's sort of an opposite example of, you've got a ram presenting the back of his horns, and you can barely see anything for annuli that you're sure of. So I'm just pointing that out as sometimes it presents well in the back of the horns to give you another clue, but sometimes it doesn't at all. Okay, let's try landmarking the third. Again, this ram here is a little tricky. Hard to know exactly what's going on. Obviously, we've got a lamb tip here. Not really seeing much else. Like, could there be a second and this be a third? Suppose like this ram is obviously well short of full curl, large growth increments. I think we could get to like 6 years old on that ram and probably not much more. So not a ram that we're super interested in. But here's what some might call a poor quality photo, but this is actually a pretty good example of what it might look like looking at rams through a lot of heat waves in the middle of the day. Now you're just seeing like pieces of annuli and you're trying to piece the story together. So here, we know there's a lamb tip here. We're pretty sure there's going to be a second annulus down here somewhere. In fact, I think I can sort of see it. And I can see a ring here that I would feel pretty comfortable landmarking as the third. Like I like the position. It makes sense. I think it's conservative to call that 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and I think I can see an eighth annulus here too. And there's still a bit of horn left. I don't know what time of year this was. Like this ram uh, appears to be 8 for sure, and we may want to get a closer look if you can get a ninth annulus counted above the hairline. Well, that could be a ram that you may want to take a good look at. Okay, a couple great field photos here. Quickly just want to say thanks. I reached out to some folks for some examples of field photos, and folks came through with some great shots. So these photos are from the Gassoff cousins, Devin Curtis. Thanks to those guys. Thanks to Andrew Walker, Nathan French, and Jason Earl for sending me some good photos. Just want to give a shout out to those folks for giving us some good examples to look at tonight. So let's look at this ram on the right first. Pretty prominent annuli, which is nice. Appears to be some brooming going on here. You can see a ring here, probably a second annulus. This presents pretty well as the third annulus here. Like it's the most prominent. It's a good location. Feel comfortable calling that landmark, and that's 3, 4, 5, 6. The seventh ring under this light and this angle doesn't present super well, but we know there's got to be at least one in between there just based on the increment. So we get to 7, and it's possible there's an eighth ring, about an inch above the hairline there. But this ram's not full curl. Again, there's some uncertainty around whether that's a true annulus. There may be uncertainty as to whether you got the bottom right. I would, suggest this is a ram you wouldn't want to shoot off of age. But if you go look at this ram here, again, like appears to be broomed a little bit. The second annulus is not really presenting itself super well, but we suspect it's in here somewhere, right? Just based off the curl. And 3, up pretty high, but again, it's not a super curly ram. Feel pretty safe about calling that 3 here, landmarking that as 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We get to 8. There's still a bit more horn growth than the previous increment. So we feel pretty confident that there's probably another ring there. Got another angle to show you. So now that ram's turned its head, we can landmark the third annulus again. So we know, okay, now it's even more broomed on this side. So we know it's broomed right around 2, probably just before 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And now again, we still got a fair bit of horn left here. And now it looks like we can see that ninth annulus fairly clearly. So if you got a good look at this ram, it might be one you might want to harvest. And in fact, we know this ram got harvested from the Gassoff crew. The Come Out Heavy boys sent me this photo. Nice that we can actually now verify what we thought we saw in the field, because we have this ram laying dead in front of us. Again, broom pretty heavy, but just in front of 2. That's what we thought. 3 back here, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and there's that ninth annulus right there. So nice old ram, fairly safe to age that one for harvest. Okay, a couple of broomed rams in the field. So I told you earlier, like even if it looks to be pretty heavily broomed, the safest bet is to call the first most prominent annulus after the brooming. Call this 2. Maybe your ram's broomed very heavily, and maybe this is 3. But at least you're erring on the side of caution by calling it 2. So I'd highly recommend that. Start there, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And 7 maybe. Not really sure what's going on with this ram from this angle. It doesn't appear to be overly old. Definitely not full curl. 7, maybe 8-year-old ram. Again, here's kind of a tricky photo, but a good representation of what you may be facing in the field. This ram appears to be broomed fairly heavily. You can barely see it, but again, we know there's probably an annulus here just based on this horn growth. To be safe, even though it's broomed pretty heavily, we're going to call this 2 here, and we're going to landmark this as 3. Again, that's up pretty high, but it's not unreasonable. You know, this ram's obviously not super curly. So if we call that 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, we can even see the 8th annulus there, and we've still got a bunch of space here on the horn. So we definitely want to get a better look at this to make sure I'm right up to this point. But if this is 8 here, still got, you know, twice as much horn growth as the previous growth increment. Pretty sure there's going to be a couple of annuli in there. And again, this ram is harvested, so we can now take a closer look at this. Here's that brooming, quite heavy. Some might jump and call this 3. Without having this ram in hand, I can't say for sure. Again, erring on the side of caution. If you're aging this in the field, just start by calling this 2. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, likely a 10th there. So this ram appears to be for sure 10. If in fact that ram is broomed super heavy and this is 3, debatable, but you know, maybe even an 11-year-old ram. We wouldn't know that for sure until we had it in hand. Okay, a few more examples here. This is a springtime photo, but again, the same concepts apply. Looking at this ram head on, we know the lamb tip up here. 2's got to be in the bottom here, although we can't see it. And so the first kind of prominent ring we can identify is up here, the 3rd annulus, 4, 5, 6. And because it's spring, that ram probably just laid an annulus, you know, a month or 2 prior. There's probably a 7th annulus there. It wouldn't present that way in the fall. Again, tough pictures. Right away, I just look at the top of the horns again, see pretty big growth increments here. And this ram, you know, blurry photo, but, you know, pretty typical of what you'd be looking at through heat waves. I see big growth increments here. Neither of these rams appear to have that maturity. You know, again, looking at the face of this ram, really short nose, kind of steep forehead, big growth increments. Probably not a ram we feel good about as far as maturity goes. Another ram here looking down from above. We can see that this ram has broomed probably around, you know, just past the lamb tip, it appears. So somewhere in here, we feel pretty confident. It looks to be right here that there's the 2nd annulus. That means we're landmarking this as the 3rd. Again, you know, it's well back at the bottom of the curl. This is not an overly curly ram, so feel good about landmarking that as 3, 4, 5, 6, and we can probably get to 7. But again, would we expect an 8th there, like close to the hairline? This is clearly like an early season ram. I would say no. You know, we're probably looking at a 7-year-old ram. Again, look at some of the facial characteristics here. That sloped forehead, really short nose. This ram really comes across as a young ram that we wouldn't want to shoot off of age. Okay, just a couple more. Bandarams here, sort of like what we're looking at. Like there's some nice looking curls and mass and, you know, kind of signs of maturity. And like a ram like this appears to be like pretty deep chested and deep belly. Both of their faces, you know, don't look overly young to me compared to this ram where, you know, even from this angle appears to have kind of a short face. So now I'm kind of interested in these 2 back rams. Lamb tip up here. 2's probably in here somewhere. 3 is not presenting super well from this angle, but I'm quite sure I see it back here. And that would sort of make sense for a ram of, you know, like this configuration with a pretty good curl. I wouldn't expect 3 to be up this high on a ram like this. So I feel pretty good at saying 3 is right there. That would be a pretty expected location for 4 here. 5, 6, 7. Still got a bunch of horn growth here. see something cutting through. Again, there's a good chance this ram's 8 years old. Maybe full curl. That might be a ram you want to take a close look at. If it's not full curl, though, this is a ram you may want to walk away from as far as shooting off of age. This ram here appears to have some maturity, like a lamb tip here. It's kind of not super curly. So we know somewhere along here there's a second annulus. Um, Probably feel pretty good landmarking this one up a bit higher as 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We get to 8 fairly easily. There's still a bit of growth there. Might be looking at a 9-year-old ram. Doesn't appear he's full curl, so this is one you're going to want to, get a close look at to see if he does in fact reach 9. Okay, couple slides left. Couple nice looking rams here. At first glance, really like sort of the characteristics of this ram. Appears to have like quite a long face, big belly, beautiful, deep horn curl. This ram, on the other hand, like I don't know, his face looks a little younger. He's got that slopey forehead. I'm seeing increments here that I'm not loving as far as maturity. Appears to be broomed a bit here. Not sure where exactly. So to be safe, we're gonna call this 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, probably 7. And then this ram we're going to look at from a different angle in a sec here. So again, sort of a blurry photo, apologize, but again, this is sort of what you're facing in the field. These are the same two rams, sorry, by the way. This is the one we think is a bit younger. Again, now we can see those like big growth increments here. Doesn't scream to be an old ram by any means. This ram though, let's take a look. Hard to see. Lamb tip, 2 should be in the bottom. 3 is not really even presenting itself. I think maybe we see it on this side. So 4, 5, 6, 7. Sorry, I kind of got mixed up on this one. Let's go back one slide. Lamb tip, 2 down here, somewhere 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and I think we get to 8 if you look at the front of the horn there. Like you can see there's an annulus that cuts through, that's above the hairline. But at best, I think this ram might be 8 years old. And if he's not full curl, beautiful ram, heavy, looks pretty long with a deep curl, but that might be one you have to walk away from if you can't make sense of that. And if you only get to 8, you don't have much wiggle room there. These are tough calls to make in the field. Okay, I think this is my last field photo. Here we have a ram bedded here that's showing us some annuli. So appears to be broomed. It looks like it's broomed off its lamb tip. So somewhere in here, I think we can see the second. Feel good about landmarking this as 3. This is back quite a bit from the bottom of the curl. Look at the top first. I'm seeing growth increments that are not super spread apart. So right away, I'm kind of interested in this ram. So if we call that 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, we get to 8. And there's still a bunch of room left. And I happen to know this was an October ram, so we know there's a bunch of hair here. Get to 8, feel pretty good that this ram's probably 9-year-old ram. So this is, if I'm hunting, shooting off the age, this is one that I might want to take a closer look at. This ram unfortunately doesn't, like with the lighting and the angle, doesn't present annuli super well. So again, that's why you have to watch these rams, get different angles, get different lighting. You've already aged this ram in a previous slide. This ram we shot, and it's a 10-year-old ram, but you really can't see that in this photo. So just keep that in mind. Okay, couple of quick concepts here. So, okay, we made it through all of the assessments, all of the sort of field examples. Hope folks found that helpful. Again, you may disagree. That's fine. The point being is that there is uncertainty around this. It's not always a pure science aging these things in the field. So my main takeaway is just to be cautious. And that's kind of brings me to this concept of 9 is the new 8. So the idea here being is that, we've always sort of set 8 as the standard of like what we'd call like an immature RAM, anything 8 and over. And from a legal perspective, 8 is that benchmark as well if it's not full curl. But I'm promoting here that if you are hunting rams, for two reasons that, we should be maybe targeting that 9-year-old ram rather than the 8-year-old ram. One, it gives you legal benefit of having more leeway when it comes time to your inspection, or if you've made a mistake in the field and you misidentified one of those rings, at least if you have believe you've aged that ram at 9, now you've got some leeway. I've demonstrated that it's not always black and white doing this in the field and even at time of inspection. So really suggest you give yourself some wiggle room there if you're shooting based on age alone. And then there's the conservation benefit of, shooting rams that are even older than 8. Like 8-year-old rams are still generally prime breeders. So, why not give that 8-year-old ram another chance to contribute to breeding? My last two summary slides here. So just some kind of philosophical stuff here. Set the expectation for your hunt from the onset. Are you going to shoot off a full curl? Are you aging, or are you looking for rams that are full curl and have some good age? Are you hunting for legality or maturity? I think it's good to assess for legality first, especially if we're talking about full curl, and then take that next step to see if it's also a mature ram before you make that decision. Education like this and like other presentations that are available are very important, but overconfidence can be dangerous in the field. I hope this presentation may have rattled your confidence just a hair to just put that seed of doubt in there that there is uncertainty around this and that it is dangerous to be overconfident or to think that this is easy when you get out there. It isn't. It can be very difficult, and that's why we really need to be cautious. So again, just a tip, make a habit of assessing every set of horns that you see. I think that becomes pretty standard once you become a sheep hunter. But really focus on trying to get your landmarks on every ram you look at and make note of how those landmarks change depending on age or horn configuration and where you might find that second annulus versus the third annulus. Really try to find that third annulus, I think, is an important message. Getting a little preachy here, but yeah, I think it's really important to remove all the pressure you put on yourself on these hunts. I know there can be pressure, external pressure, whether that's family and friends or social media or whatever it may be. If you put pressure on yourself, that's where mistakes can occur. If your measure of success is killing a ram on that hunt, you're putting pressure on yourself. So maybe your measure of success should be seeing rams, seeing mature rams, having a good time. The killing of a ram, consider that sort of, your what your desired outcome is, but not your ultimate measure of success. And that will take pressure off. And you need to take pressure off so you can walk away from rams. And consider this, that the success rate for stone sheep last I checked is averages about 10%. So if your measure of success is killing a ram, right away the odds are against you. About on average 1 in 10 sheep hunters are going to get a ram. The other 9 are going home empty. And no one cares if you don't shoot a ram on your hunt. You may think they do. You may have that perception, oh, what are people going to think back home if I don't come home with anything? And the reality is no one cares if you don't shoot a ram. And frankly, most people don't really care that much if you do shoot a ram. Folks will be happy for you, but it's not something people are going to remember you for the rest of your life if you shoot a ram. The only time people generally care if you shoot a ram is if you shoot the wrong ram. And so there I'm talking about if you make a mistake and shoot an illegal ram. That's when people care. One last little tip here. Yeah, if you see those big growth increments up top, stop. That's my suggestion there. Get close. Like that really is an important piece. Trying to, like everything I've shown you here, this is very difficult to do in the field, and it just gets more and more difficult the farther and farther away you are from a sheep. So get close, wait for good conditions, wait for the wind to die, the light to get right, the heat waves to dissipate, whatever it may be, but getting closer is important. Most cases, you're going to eventually be able to get closer to sheep if you got to come back the next day or if you got to wait them out. They're 90% of the time you can get closer. And then lastly, if this is overwhelming or if you're new to this, I highly recommend trying to find a mentor and go with experienced sheep hunters that can help you make these determinations in the field that you can bounce ideas off of. Um, and that will go a long way in making the right decisions. I think that's it. I took you guys through almost 2 hours of that. I hope there's still a few folks on here. I know we're getting late, so if there are questions, I'm happy to answer any. Folks can reach out to me at any time afterwards and have these conversations as well. And yeah, I just really want to thank everyone for their time. Took a bunch of time in people's evening, so I really appreciate everyone attending, and I hope this was somewhat helpful.
Epic Mike, I guess, are you comfortable with a few questions? You could take a couple more minutes, or
Yeah,
are
I'm
you?
I'm happy to keep going, and yeah, if folks have to drop off, that's totally understandable. But yeah, definitely happy to try to answer some questions.
Okay, cool. Okay, we will do that. Before we do that, I just want to say a huge thank you to you, Mike, on behalf of the Wild Sheep Society BCR membership and everyone on here tonight. And just for our listeners, just if you could appreciate that, Mike's doing this because he's passionate. He cares about the resource. He's a passionate sheep hunter, and he doesn't have to do it. And if it wasn't for him wanting to do it, he wouldn't be here. So we're fortunate to have him. And just to be frank, Mike, my phone and my messages have been lighting up with this is the best webinar ever. This is the best session I've ever heard. So, and not just one or two, it's been a whole bunch. So thank you for doing that. And then before we jump into these questions, I guess for our listeners that are still on, there's a Q&A box on the bottom box there on the right-hand side of Zoom. So if you just want to type in your questions in there, and we'll present those to Mike as well. So if you want to stick around for those, for additional resources, the society we just launched a online course with Silvercore. So Silvercore's generously donated the space on their site. It's Gen 1, so there's lots of work to be done, but it's kind of our first generation. So go over to Silvercore if you want to do a horn aging course virtually with them. And then on our website as well at wildsheepsociety.com, there's additional resources. We'll post the link to the new course there. It's for, like I said, it's Gen 1. We're just kind of getting it out there right now. So there's probably a few things to work out, but it's another resource for you. And then at our Salutes Conservation and Mountain Hunting Expo on February 26th to 28th, we'll be doing horn aging live there. So come to the show, take in our Sheep Hunting University, and there'll be guys like Mike and others that'll be presenting on these topics. So again, Mike, just thanks so much for your time today, and really, really grateful for you being here. So with that, looks like we got a bunch of questions. Greg, do you want to start us off on some of these questions?
Yeah, let's do it. Hearing about the second year growth may be debatable, leading to many underage rams. Do you know the average data numbers of the 7B legal ram harvest and underage numbers in the last handful of years?
A little bit, yeah. Again, I'm not super involved in that in the most recent years, but I do try to keep tabs on it a little bit. So I know I referenced a year back in 2021 when we had a really poor year across the north, and that was in the Peace region and the Skeena. Um, I think there was nearly 20 illegal rams in the Peace region alone. I don't know what the number was for the Skeena. I think it was high that year as well, but it fluctuates. Prior to that, we really averaged around 3 to 4 illegal rams each year in the Peace, in the region I was working in. But then we had a huge spike. But then the year following that, it went back down to sort of the levels we'd expect. I think around 6, which is still a bit higher than we'd like. And then I think it was the next year it spiked back up to 14 in the Peace region specifically. And then I believe my colleague Rael Hartley presented on this last week in Fort St. John. I think there was only 2 or 3 illegal rams killed in the Peace region this past year. So that's a really good sign. Hopefully it stays that way. I do want to, yeah, just state that I think there is progress being made, and I think hunters are becoming more diligent and taking the time to make the assessments, taking the time to educate themselves prior to going on the hunts. And a lot of it really is thanks to Wild Sheep Society for really spearheading this initiative around aging and assessments and giving people the educational material that they need.
Beautiful. Next question. Does the black horn growth at the base indicate the current year's growth?
Can for sure. Yeah, that's a good point. That's something I may want to consider including in my presentation in future years. If you see, generally it only shows on early season rams with short hair and kind of fresh growth. Sometimes that newer growth will present as a black coloration that sort of fades from black into like the typical patterns, or sorry, coloration. So if you're looking back from or looking down from your last annulus towards the horn base and you're seeing some black coloration or black growth in there, that's likely you're looking at that year's growth. That means there's no more annuli past that point of that last annulus if you're seeing black growth beyond that point. So if you're seeing that, don't expect to see any more annuli at that, closer to the base. I hope I explained that. Okay.
Sounds good. All right. Next question. Third or fourth annuli which is usually the most prominent, or is there a difference?
Yeah, I think I saw that question. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that might have been from someone who joined a bit late. Is that what that said, Greg?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, miss.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, all good. I just wanted to be sure. I hope that I presented that off the top fairly clearly around how to landmark that third annulus specifically. The third generally is the most prominent of the first three, if that makes sense. The fourth, I hear people reference the fourth as a good landmark too, and I'm sure that's the case. I find the third is a better way to start. That fourth annulus can be, yeah, is often very prominent. It often shows up at sort of a horizontal position that's kind of like parallel to the eye of the ram or on a level to the eye, but that can vary as well too. Like just like how the third annulus can vary, like on a not very curly ram, it can present quite high. On the very curly ram, we can see that fourth annulus present fairly low, like down to, whatever that be, maybe 5 o'clock potentially, or 4 o'clock if we're looking at the face of the clock on a really curly ram. So the fourth annulus is a good one to look for too. If you can go back through my presentation at a later date, yeah, focus on the third, and then you can start looking for that fourth one at the same time to see maybe for you that's a better option for landmarking. You prefer landmarking the fourth.
Okay. What's the average month that a thin horn usually creates an annuli?
I don't know for sure. I'm pretty sure though that it's late winter. Um, I haven't seen this like in the literature necessarily. I'm sure it's out there, but it's like when the growth comes to an absolute halt, like so the rams getting through, or a ewe for that matter, they're getting grinding through the winter. They're getting to the end, probably around March. Now they're not putting any of their feed or forage into horn growth. Uh, Anything they're taking in is going in to keeping their body conditioned. So it's probably around that very end of winter, March, when horn growth comes to an absolute stop. And that's when the annuli are formed. And then once that snow melts and things green up, then we start getting that growth again, like into April and May.
From your experience, are there specific areas up north that, due to habitat and geography, make aging rams a bit more difficult to age?
Yeah.
Consistently more false annuli, or maybe just lighter colored horns?
Hmm. Um, there's definitely geographical factors involved, but there's no hard rules around that. Like, um, if we vary in location greatly, like say if we look at Northwest Territory Dall sheep versus Southern Range stone sheep, they may grow differently in a sense, like overall, but there's still going to be a ton of variation amongst individuals in different geographic areas. So it's really hard. It's a hard question to answer. It is something you may need to consider the area that you're hunting in, and the different effects that it may have on horn growth. Certainly, there's areas that are more productive that you may see bigger growth increments and bigger horns, more length, more mass. But that you can find those rams in more unproductive areas too, and it's very variable. So um, it's a consideration, but I think the important thing is to go back to the fundamentals of horn growth that are pretty consistent in sheep, no matter where they are in, northern BC or Yukon or Northwest Territories. The fundamentals remain, and the need for assessing with extra caution if you're assessing age remains no matter where you are. So I kind of copped out answering that question. There are probably geographical differences, but there's no hard rules around that.
All right. I don't see any more questions on the board.
You've sufficiently educated everybody, Mike.
Well,
Again, on behalf of the society, thanks so much for doing this tonight. And then to all the people that tuned in, thanks so much for your support for wild sheep and the thing that we so much love. And just good luck to everyone this fall. Be safe, and just thanks for supporting the society. And we'll do more of these in the future, and there'll be live ones next year as well. So we hope to see you out to some of the live events. And thanks everyone, and thanks for being here, Mike.
yeah, thanks everyone. Appreciate it.
Thanks for coming out.